Hi, everybody. Welcome to our session today. My name is Stacey, and I'm the Director of Outreach at the Ohio History Connection. And I'm going to toss it over to Nina Thomas, the moderator for today's session.
Good morning. Welcome to this conference. This session is called the American Indian Relations Policy and Best Practices. And we have two presenters today. We have Ben Garcia, Deputy Executive Director and Chief Learning Officer, and Stacey Halfmoon of the Ohio History Connection. During this session, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A, and you can use chat to talk to everybody who is attending today. The presenters will be taking some time at the end of the session to answer your questions. So please use the Q&A. And I'm going to turn it over to our presenters.
All right. Hi, everyone. I am just going to share my screen and start our PowerPoint. I'll be toggling between some video and PowerPointing. So hold on one second. Here we go. All right. So we would like to start just by giving a little bit more of an introduction and our backgrounds, how we came to be the moderators for this panel. I am gonna actually ask my colleague, Stacey Halfmoon, to begin.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to feel like I'm in Ohio with you. I'm actually in Oklahoma, but I'm really excited to be a part of this panel with Ben. My name is Stacey Halfmoon, and I was formerly the American Indian Relations Director at the Ohio History Connection from 2015 to 2019. And since I have come back to Oklahoma, where I work for the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma as the Senior Director for the Choctaw Cultural Center. I am a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma. I'm also Choctaw and Delaware. I was basically born and raised in Oklahoma, grew up here with pretty traditional grandparents and family, and ended up studying anthropology and going to work for my tribe right out of college at the Caddo Nation, which was just an important part of my young adult life, to participate in repatriation and cultural preservation for the Caddo Nation. And so I just feel blessed to have been in this field of museum work, history work, interpretation work for most of my career, and been able to work with a lot of different tribes as a liaison. So working with OHC was a true blessing and a wonderful experience. I'm excited to talk about what we were able to do with the American Indian policy that we're going to talk about today. Thank you.
All right. Now, sorry, I think that whole time you were not looking at Stacey's face. Is that correct? Well, there she is. Come on. There's a face I want to look at. And of course, I don't want you to miss this one. So I'm Ben Garcia, and I'm Deputy Executive Director here and Chief Learning Officer at the Ohio History Connection. I came on board about a year ago. And prior to that, I was working as the Deputy Director of a museum in San Diego called the Museum of Us, although back then it was called the San Diego Museum of Man. That's really where I had the opportunity to work as part of staff and group of community partners, and most notably members of the Kumeyaay Nation. There are 12 Kumeyaay federally recognized tribes in San Diego County. And we really worked together to shift the way the museum worked in relationship to the bodies and belongings of American Indians that were being held there. And also the relationship, the practices related to all of the categories that are covered in the American Indian policy that Stacey was so essential in creating for the Ohio History Connection today. So today we're going to be covering a little bit of the background. Stacey will talk to you a little bit about how the policy came to be here at the Ohio History Connection, the work that she and others did to bring it forward. We will have a chance to watch a couple of clips from an American Indian policy video we have not completed, but that's in progress. So, bear with any glitches or typos you might see, but you'll be able to see some clips which will sort of help you understand our approach to the policy a little bit differently. And then Stacey and I are each going to be covering a couple sections of the policy to just give you an overview. The policy is available on our website, and if you go to ohiohistory.org/AIR for American Indian Relations, you'll find it there on the landing page, and we will have that address as well, and I'll pop it into the chat a little bit later on. So anyway, I'm so happy to be here in Ohio, where the State History Organization, thanks to the leadership of Stacey, is already moving forward and leading in relationship to a lot of museums and organizations, the ways in which consultation and partnership is happening with American Indian descendant communities. So I'll hand it over now to Stacey to give us a little bit of the background on how this all came to be.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I just wanted to start by reading a little clip from the policy that says, the Ohio History Connection acknowledges the 15,000-year presence of Native people in the land we now call Ohio. The cultural and political contributions that were made by both the ancestors of and present-day American Indian tribes should be honored and celebrated. The Ohio History Connection seeks to honor that history by creating a policy that outlines how the organization will conduct itself and how it shall engage federally recognized American Indian tribes that hold shared interests, histories, and ancestral ties to Ohio. So I think that's a really powerful statement in the policy, and it kind of leads to the question, how did we get here? So just wanted to share a little bit about what that process was like and the different steps that were taken to get us to a statement like that being incorporated in a policy and adopted by the organization. And, some of that began with just my personal background, having worked for the Defense Department. The Defense Department, where I was a tribal liaison, had been one of the first federal agencies to pass an American Indian/Alaska Native policy. And so working with them and seeing what implementation of a policy at a federal level look like, and that a lot of the work isn't just in a policy being adopted, that is a lot of the work, but it's also the follow on, and it's how do you bring that policy to life? How do you interpret that policy? How do you apply it to your everyday work? So being a part of that and seeing that on a national level really had a big impact on me. As you all know, policy can be very important to our work. And so when I was with the Ohio History Connection and approached our leadership and Bert Logan, our executive director, that's where I started. It was like, I have an idea. And I'm wondering if you might be open to this, where we adopt a policy. I realize we're not a federal agency or even a state agency fully, but we have an opportunity to help guide everybody through policy. And so it really begins with that leadership approval. That's where it began for this journey, is everyone being open to that, being willing to explore it. And so from there, things took off. I asked if we could hire a consultant. So this was a member of the Delaware tribe who had worked for the U.S. Forest Service and had written the policy for the Southeast region, an American Indian policy for the Forest Service. So he came on board and helped me and others begin to draft this policy. So you can imagine all along, it's a lot of give and take. It's, okay, we drafted a section, now we'd like to take this and share it with tribes at the Tribal Nations Conference. We would get feedback there, very positive, keep going, keep working on it. We would take drafts of the policy and share it with the organizational leadership at the Ohio History Connection, including updating the board of directors where we were in that process and what all would be covered in the policy. Key departments at the organization, you really want groups like the SHPO office, your education, your collections team to have a chance to look at that policy and really think about how it might impact them. So a lot of back and forth, edits, and more edits. The devil's in the details, right? So some of that work is just looking at the use of words, because words are very important, how they're interpreted. So we wanted to really think about the words that were used in the policy. Then there's always a legal review. You've got to bring the lawyers into it. And so we had a legal review to make sure everything was okay there, made some edits afterward, and just continued this process over a 2-year period. And finally, after sharing it with tribes at the most recent Tribal Nations Conference, and everyone kind of being okay with the final draft, this was adopted by the board in, was it November of 2019, I believe. So very exciting. That's, some of the process. That's a little bit about why there was motivation for me as the Director of American Indian Relations. I think Ohio History Connection being such a large organization, I felt like could really benefit from this guidance. And so there are 4 parts of the policy that we're going to talk about today that we thought should be included. These 4 sections cover areas where input and consultation with tribal nations are most frequently triggered. So for example, there is a background in history as part of the policy. And then the 4 sections are Section 1, Interpretation and Education. Section 2, Stewardship of American Indian Sites. Section 3, Care for Ancestral Remains, Funerary Objects and Cultural Objects. And Section 4, Consultation with Tribal Nations. And so every single section has a policy statement, a background and purpose, and best practices. And we'll walk through some examples of those today. But that is a summary of, in a nutshell, of the process we went through as an organization to have this policy adopted and why.
Great, thank you. Thanks for covering that, Stacey. We're going to have a chance for questions at the end of the presentation, but go ahead and drop them into the Q&A at any point that they occur to you, because Nina will be helping us out with sorting through all of that. I'm going to switch now, share screen, and connect to a clip from the American Indian Policy video that we're producing and that we're going to be using to help sites in our network and folks on our staff really sort of understand the rationale and the different aspects of the policy. So this one is going to be a little bit focused on the education and interpretation section, which is one of the sections I'll be covering after the video. Here we go. See if this works. Okay, let me do this. Stacia or someone text me if this isn't working, all right?
The importance of sharing the Native perspective is because we're here. For many people, they tend to think that we have gone extinct, that we're no longer here. But there are still 570 some odd tribes in the United States that are alive and well. And that's one of the things that I've run into that it really bothers me that there's a population in America that thinks that American Indians don't exist anymore, because we do. And our lives are very much just like yours. You know, we face the same issues, the same day-to-day drudgery, if you will, you know, work, school, families. We're not that different. We're just ethnically different as far as being part of society. We are part and parcel of society. I don't think a lot of people realize that. I don't think a lot of people realize that American Indians are alive and well, you know, and not just in little pockets throughout the country. We're all over the place. You just don't know it.
Each year, the Ohio History Connection and site partners reach a vast audience that includes students, professionals, families, researchers, and educators. We are committed to including interpretations about American Indian people, histories, cultures, and governments as part of these offerings.
It is particularly important to present and share Native perspectives because they have been largely missing from the narrative of American Indian historical research, writings, and general interpretation.
In all interpretation, programming, and exhibitions, including first-person American Indian perspectives creates new and important learning opportunities for all audiences of the Ohio History Connection, Ohioans, and the general public.
For Ohio History Connection sponsored American Indian programs and presentations, work with the American Indian Relations Division to identify American Indian content experts such as tribal leaders, tribal historians, tribal staff, tribal lecturers, tribal cultural experts, tribal storytellers, or other tribal community members with related knowledge or expertise.
Get input or guidance from tribal nations when developing or presenting interpretations of American Indian stories, histories, and or cultures, as their expertise may enhance the interpretations and or offer Native perspectives of history.
Develop and share the stories of modern tribal peoples or families related to removal, boarding schools, allotments, cultural practices, or other topics of interest to tribal communities.
Exercise sensitivity when interpreting American Indian sites that may be considered culturally significant and or sacred. Invite tribes to determine and share recommendations about what are appropriate and inappropriate behaviors at or near any site that has been identified as sacred.
All programs sponsored by the Ohio History Connection and or held at any of the sites in the site network shall accurately and authentically represent American Indian people or events. Citizens of those federally recognized tribes shall be utilized when events or programs at Ohio History Connection sites portray their nations, cultures, or prominent historic figures.
Each November, the Ohio History Connection will honor National Native American Heritage Month initiatives and create learning opportunities for the public related to American Indian people, culture, and governments.
In a lot of ways, the stories we hear are wrong. I mean, you can look at mascots, whether it be from the Washington football team or the Cleveland baseball team. Those mascots that you see were not designed and have not been supported by tribal governments or tribal organizations. Those are by some other person that's, I'm going to say, probably not Native American. And I think those do a lot of harm to the wider public because it spins a narrative for folks that aren't familiar with Native Americans, that forget Native Americans exist. That's just not true. And I think by working with tribes to tell the accurate story and the accurate history will go a long way to improving relationships with tribal communities around the country, really.
As early as the 2000s, when I was in graduate school, I had a professor say that most Native Americans lack the education to interpret their own culture. I took a lot of umbrage to that statement because we do interpret our own cultures. Education is not necessarily part of interpretation. And I do think that now museums, historical societies are moving more toward us being part of that interpretation, telling our story, our side. I don't want to say our side of things, but our recollections of history. And I think it's time that happened. It really should have happened a long time ago. But now that it is taking place, I think that it makes some people uncomfortable because history is not always pretty and it's not always happy. And I have come to believe that Native Americans are a reminder that history is not always happy and pretty. And maybe that's why there is some pushback in us interpreting our own culture for museums, interpreting our own exhibits, things like that. I think Americans in general don't like to look at the bad parts. I think we like to skim over slavery. I think we like to skim over Japanese internment camps. I think we like to skim over removal and what happened to my ancestors. And we keep repeating this. We keep making these same mistakes. All you have to do to see it is to go to the border camps right now. That's nothing new. That's colonialism. That's how it works. And for people to not make that connection really bothers me.
All right, so I'm going to be briefly covering the two of the sections in the policy, education and interpretation, and also care of human remains and cultural items. Because that video was so focused on that, the video will go through each section and address a little bit of the background, address a little bit of the policy, and address a little bit of the best practices. So I'm going to not spend a whole lot of time on education interpretation because you just heard it from the mouths of the people who can do it, who can do it much better than I. I'll focus a little bit more on the other piece. I'm going to go back now and share the PowerPoint and walk you through a couple of slides. Then we'll have another video clip, and then Stacey will present her two sections. All right. Oops. All right. We are going to so in terms of interpretation and education, you sort of heard that our policy is essentially focused on three ideas: authenticity, accuracy, and integrating these American Indian histories throughout our educational products and throughout the interpretation at the sites. And it's really predicated on the concept of consultation. You'll see that throughout this entire policy. What this policy does more than anything is just help museums understand that the best practice when it comes to working with American Indian belongings or bodies is that idea of nothing about us without us. Bring in tribal partners to help you make decisions about the whole host of ways in which you care for and interpret their belongings. The background and each of the sections in the policy does policy, background and purpose, and best practices. So the slides sort of follow that model as well. The purpose, the reason, the background for this is that essential expertise has largely been missing in the American Indian histories presented at OHC in the past and in many of our institutions. And that's because we didn't include the descendants and the people who were most directly connected to those histories and legacies. There's been an academic bias in Western institutions against American Indian methodologies for recording their histories, specifically oral traditions. And the way we correct for that in best practices is we privilege American Indian voice, and we make sure that American Indian voices are centered moving forward. Best practices boil down to that one idea of consultation. Another section of the policy relates to the care for ancestral remains, funerary objects, and cultural objects. Many of you may be stewarding objects that originated in American Indian communities, whether historically or were made by American Indians today. Some of you might be stewarding organizations where the bodies, the remains of American Indian ancestors are being held. And so the policy addresses this because it's certainly extremely germane to our organization. In the policy, we limit access until we receive direction from tribes. We maximize privacy and respect around the remains of American Indian ancestors. And we are engaging in consultation under NAGPRA and broadly. So NAGPRA is the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, a federal act law that was enacted 30 years ago. Many large institutions are still working with tribes to complete the work of NAGPRA, which is really consultation on a whole category of American Indian belongings, but especially on American Indian human remains and funerary items. The Ohio History Connection holds the third largest collection of the third largest number of ancient American Indian ancestors that are culturally unaffiliated. And so that's a big piece of the work that we're going to be doing moving forward. The background and purpose for this part of the policy is, of course, in our organization that we were started as the Ohio State Archaeological and Historical Society in 1885, largely founded to extract and house bodies and items from ancient American Indian burial mounds around the state. Over the course of the past, I guess, sort of 50 years, beginning about 20 years before NAGPRA legislation was enacted, American Indians were organizing to advocate for repatriation of their ancestors' remains and other categories of their ancestors' belongings through what ended up being the NAGPRA law. Now, NAGPRA was federal legislation that was passed unanimously in both houses of our national legislature. So it had complete bipartisan support, and it was a law that was enacted to redress an historic injustice. All of those legislators recognized that there was an injustice perpetuated against American Indians in the ways in which their ancestors' graves and belongings were taken without consultation with their living descendants. And so NAGPRA is addressing that. And the Ohio History Connection holds over 7,200 sets of American Indian ancestral remains and over 110,000 associated funerary objects. We also have tens of thousands of other items that may constitute cultural patrimony or have sacred use, which are other categories that will make them eligible for consultation and repatriation potentially under NAGPRA. So our work is going to be very focused over the next 10 years on working with descendant tribes to determine what the ultimate disposition is for all of these belongings and for the bodies of their ancestors. In terms of best practice for doing this work, even if you don't have a whole lot of resources to move the work forward, start by investing in a plan, a NAGPRA plan. We worked with a consultant who we're happy to recommend to you, because just sort of understanding the scope of the work ahead is going to be very helpful. The plan will allow you to access things like NAGPRA grants from the National Park Service, and we'll help you get that work moving forward. And even if you don't have NAGPRA eligible items, but you have items that are American Indian in origin, and you've never consulted with American Indians about how you should care for them, how and whether they should be displayed. The best practice is to assume that you cannot do something until you have positive confirmation that you can. Most of us in museums have worked with the reverse assumption. We'll do something until we learn that we're not supposed to, and then we'll stop. So we recommend that the best practice is in fact the inverse of that, that you assume that when it comes to items that originated in American Indian communities that came into your museums certainly before 1990, that you probably shouldn't use them for research or display unless you have permission. And then finally, make this as easy on the tribes as possible. Do as much of the legwork as you can, provide tribes with as much information as possible, offer to apply for NAGPRA consultation grants that will help fund tribes' participation in the process of consultation. And one thing that we're doing is also working with tribes to identify sites where we could potentially rebury ancestors and funerary items once they've been repatriated here in Ohio. We have the advantage of having resources, namely state lands and lands that we control where we're going to be able to do that. So those are just some of the thoughts and best practices related to this category of care of ancestral remains, funerary objects, and cultural objects. I'm going to now move to another clip on the video, and that will set up the two sections that Stacia is going to be talking with you about. So hold on 1 second while I do that shift. Sorry, it's just going to take me a second to move to the right point on the video. Okay. And now. This is the exciting part. Watching screen sharing in progress. Share. Here we go. All right.
Why had I never read anything about Newark Earthwork Mountains? Because you here in Ohio didn't even realize the treasures that you had. Because you didn't write about them. Because you didn't understand what you had. You have the pyramids, the equivalent of the pyramids right here. You have the equivalent of the Great Wall of China right here. You have Mount Uluru right here. You have the Acropolis right here. You have the Colosseum right here. I've been to all of those places. And when I walked and saw Newark Earthwork Mounds, I cannot begin to tell you how I felt that day. I laughed, I cried, I wept. I was joyous. I was angry. I have grown up in a church. So I have my Indian spirituality, but I have a Christian spirituality too. And the verse came to me that said, "Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do." We shouldn't be playing golf on top of sacred, spiritual Indian mounds.
American Indian historic sites can be defined as those sites that tell the story of American Indian culture, history, and events that shaped the current contemporary identity of the American Indian today.
These include significant ancient or pre-contact archaeological sites, ancient earthworks, places of significant historical events such as births, deaths, important speeches and battles, places of treaty negotiations, and events leading up to the Great Removal.
Of the 58 sites and museums in the Ohio History Connection site network, over half are American Indian sites or have American Indian components. As we seek to more fully understand the cultural contributions of American Indians who lived here and shaped this landscape, it is important to acknowledge that each of these places or sites carry its own stories.
Some of these sites are considered sacred by American Indian nations. They are believed to be imbued with special culture, spiritual, religious, or ceremonial significance. The Ohio History Connection recognizes that the continued existence of and access to tribally designated sacred and/or revered sites is vital to American Indian culture.
Regularly review existing exhibitions and other interpretive elements at sites to ensure they reflect American Indian perspectives. This may create opportunity to update exhibits or programs working in partnerships with tribes.
Tribal staff or representatives may be interested in contributing content, stories, programs, and/or guidance. The Ohio History Connection is here to support this relationship building, planning, or other needs.
All right, so you can see there's more of that video. We'll be sharing that out more broadly when we finish it up in the next month or so. But I'll hand it over to Stacey now to address a couple of sections on stewardship. You saw a bit about that, and then also consultation. So go ahead, Stacey.
Okay. And I guess my slides will pop up.
Oh yeah, let me get those for you. Running back and forth in and out of this share screen. Here we go.
You're doing a great job.
Oh, I know. Thank you. Thanks for saying so, but I really realize that.
So I'll just reiterate, I realize we just watched a clip that covers a lot about this section on stewardship of American Indian sites. And just to reiterate, you know, when we talk about the three sections, there's some policy statements that I think are important. And certainly this pertains to the Ohio History Connection, but I think you can think about this in terms of any American Indian site in Ohio. In managing the American Indian historic sites, the Ohio History Connection shall seek the advice and cooperation of federally recognized American Indian tribes having an ancestral or historic connection to those sites. Another policy statement is related to guidelines that the Ohio History Connection issued in March of 2018, and the guidelines address daily site management. So those things we're doing on a daily basis, working at these sites or having facilities open at sites where it says management activities, daily site management activities provide guidance for site managers and staff related to American Indian education, interpretation, programs, events, and even items for sale. The guidelines are also a part of the policy, and they really do help with some of those more in the weeds, day-to-day activities and how we manage our sites. The background and purpose, it was covered in some of those comments, but I think it's important to remember that out of the 58, I think it's 58 at this point, it was 59 historic sites and museums that are in the Ohio History Connection site network. over half of those sites are American Indian sites, or they have American Indian history components. That's a really significant number. You know, it's one of the reasons I think when you look at the collections, when you look at the number of sites, Ohio is such a long and rich history of American Indian people that we really need to remember that when we're doing work at or preserving an American Indian site. Some of the best practices around the section on American Indian sites and their stewardship are when you're learning of or planning for activities that may physically impact an American Indian site. This could be archaeology, this can be construction, even doing basic site improvements, maintenance, research, or even public events. It's a good idea to consult with the Ohio History Connection. Some of those things can have impact. We had reached out many times in the past when there was going to be an impact such as archaeology, and let our tribal partners know just so they were aware and had an opportunity to express any questions or concerns around that activity. I think it shows that you're a good partner, you know, you're a good neighbor, you let people know what's going on and stay in communication. Another best practice is exercising care when interpreting American Indian sites that may be considered culturally significant or sacred. And so you saw Chief Friend in that video clip talking about that. You know, there are certain ways to approach how you talk about sites. And when they're sensitive, if there were maybe deaths occurred there, maybe people are buried there, maybe it was a significant battle that had loss of life. We just want to be sensitive to how we go about interpreting that history. And did we just interpret it on our own, or did we reach out to community members and think about some of their sensitivities or some of their preferences for how we talk about that site and include them in the interpretation? Next, I'll quickly cover consultation with tribal nations. And really that's what the entire policy is about in a way. It's about working with our tribal partners and making a concerted effort to have dialogue and allow our tribal partners to contribute when there's enough time to then turn and incorporate some of those recommendations. So I'll read one of the policy statements on the consultation with tribal nations that I feel is important. And that is that tribal nations historically affiliated with the land that became the state of Ohio will be provided the opportunity for timely and meaningful engagement regarding policies, programs, and actions which may have tribal implications. The background and purpose, just to share a little bit on this section, there are approximately 45, probably closer to 50. You know, the more you research and work with your partners, the more you learn. But there are approximately 45 to 50 modern day federally recognized tribes that are affiliated or considered successors in interest to the indigenous peoples of Ohio. So this includes the tribes native to Ohio and tribes that settled in Ohio that after they were displaced during 2 centuries of Euro-American political and military pressure. So you know, the way we approached what tribes we would at least start with in the policy to list who was affiliated, we base that on the Treaty of Greenville. There are certainly other ways you can affiliate other tribes. Some of the older sites, Fort Ancient period, Adena, Hopewell, those date back a lot earlier. And so sometimes that, you know, you enter into a dialogue about what archaeologists think, who those people may have been, looking at ethnographic records, working with tribes that understand what their connections are to the land. But that's where we started with the policy, to get a list of approximately 50 tribes that we would recommend reaching out to in the work at Ohio History Connection to consult. Consultation, coordination, and collaboration with federally recognized American Indian tribes is integral to all federal agencies' trust responsibility to tribes. So by extension, organizations such as the Ohio History Connection that receive federal funding, federal permits, or are engaged in other activities regulated by federal laws like the National Historic Preservation Act or NAGPRA, they must engage in consultation with tribes. So a few of the best practices around consultation are seek to identify and cultivate relationships with federally recognized tribes that consider Ohio as all or part of their Aboriginal homelands. You can demonstrate respect to tribal officials in the same manner you would as officials of a sovereign nation, because with every federally recognized tribe being a sovereign nation, those individuals are heads of state, just like you saw in the video, Chief Glenna Wallace, and she was speaking at the State History Day in Ohio just a couple of years ago. There's also etiquette to think about. This is in the policy. I'm just sharing a couple, but I think this section is important. There is etiquette around doing work with tribal people or community or tribal leaders. So here's two examples. When tribal leaders or representatives speak, be quiet and listen. Do not interrupt them. And I have seen many cases in the middle of a consultation it's tough to watch when it's happening, when somebody continues to interrupt an elder and not allow them the space they need to, share what they're sharing. So that's a basic etiquette best practice. Another one is to demonstrate respect for tribal elders in particular. If meeting in person, be sure basic needs such as food and water are tended to. Be quiet and listen and do not interrupt. So those were just a couple of etiquettes I wanted to highlight. There are more listed in the policy, because when it really does boil down to that moment when it's people just meeting, sitting in a room meeting, there are things to think about when you're working with the tribal community if you never have before. So we wanted to be sure and include those. But overall, this section on consultation is important. I think we're all really happy that it is an integral part of the policy. So that covers my two sections for now.
Great. All right. So we have about 10 or 12 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit about what some of the next steps are for OHC around implementation now that the policy was drafted and passed and approved by the Board of Trustees. We gathered the team to really find out what staff felt they needed to be able to really fully integrate the values as well as the procedures and best practices across the organization. And, it really boiled down to two things that our staff, who are largely not Indigenous, felt they needed to be able to do this. And both of them were really around training, training around sort of cultural competency, etiquette in the way that Stacey was talking about. Just, we have a lot of staff, and I'm sure a lot of you all don't want to start off on the wrong foot or put your foot wrong in the conversation. And so there was a real request from our staff to the leadership to provide trainings in cultural competency and also training in the history here in these lands that are now called Ohio of the American Indian presence here. Stacey referenced 45 to 50 federally recognized tribes that have at some point their ancestors lived here in Ohio, whether they were Indigenous to these lands or whether they came and lived here for some period of time. And I think that probably most of the staff in our organization wouldn't be able to speak to even half of that history. So for those of us who are working in museums and holding organizations, knowing the history that many of your guests are going to come in with a strong awareness of is essential as you're meeting with them and as you're talking about this. So, you know, even as historians, even as staff in history organizations, I think we all have been sobered by the amount of history we're just not familiar with. So that's, you know, one big sort of category. The other piece around next steps, really for us, as I said before, our organization has a lot of work to do to meet its obligations under NAGPRA, under federal law. That work of returning ancestors and funerary items and sacred items and items of cultural patrimony, that is often going to be the first place that your tribal partners are going to want to engage with you. You may be interested in getting them to help you create an education program or an exhibit, but make sure you know the status, your status in relationship to NAGPRA and your status in relationship to holding belongings of significance to them, because we need to make sure that as we begin to engage with tribal partners, that this is not an extractive relationship, that we're not just extracting yet a whole other different category of things from tribes. In this time, it's expertise and you know, and sort of their knowledge, right? And so make sure that you know what you're offering tribes before you start asking them to do things for you, and make sure you understand the history of your institution to tribal communities and to the belongings that you're holding. So those are some of the next steps that we're really thinking about here at the Ohio History Connection. And now we will open it up for any questions. Let's see, I'll pull open the Q&A. From Jen Johnson, apologies if this was mentioned, but when you say consult, collaborate, et cetera in these policies, does that mean OHC is paying tribal members for their expertise and time? Stacey, do you want to address that, or do you want me to?
We both can.
Yeah.
I'll say that it does. I don't think you have to assume that every time you say consult, collaborate, it has to involve money. However, I think when we, in some examples, when we consulted at OHC previously, if we asked for a lot of their time that was informing some of our projects, we did our best to, again, be good partners, offer honorariums or buy meals, because it does involve their time as well. And some of these people work for their nation, they're busy people, they're tribal leaders. And so you want to be respectful. It certainly doesn't mean if you just want to pick up a phone and have a conversation, introduce yourself and talk about your project, that you have to pay them for that. So it's not assumed every time, but certainly there are opportunities to compensate people for their time and expertise. And when those arise, it's I always recommend doing that. That's what I'll say. Ben, what about you?
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I mean, just like any other consultant that you would hire to come in and help you with your interpretive goals, assuming that, that people deserve to be compensated for their time makes sense. And, I think that goes also under the category of make this as easy on your tribal partners as possible. So, look for grants, look for opportunities to help them, to help defray the cost of their travel, defray the cost of, the time that they're spending, with you. Like, you really should be looking at how you can, host and also potentially compensate visitors, who are coming to help you solve a problem. So Michelle Persons, please provide some insight for how to best establish connections with tribal representatives outside the Ohio region for interpretation of objects. Several different tribes are represented in our collection, for example, Inuit, Southwestern, and Great Plains, etc. Stacey, do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure, absolutely. A great way to establish connection with tribes outside the region is to, there are a number of ways. It all boils down to communication. So a nice thing to do is to do a formal letter that kind of describes who you are, why you're reaching out, maybe a little bit about your organization. If you're writing or reaching out specifically about an object, you would want to describe that object. And then always follow up with a phone call. I think making it personal, because so many tribes, sometimes they'll have one staff person that's handling every single NAGPRA request, every single historic preservation request. They are really busy people. And so sometimes you have to go the extra mile to reach out personally or offer to go meet them. I know that's hard with so many tribes being out of state, but I would definitely recommend reaching out and sharing as much as you can about why you're reaching out through a letter, following up with a phone call. And a lot of it also involves research to understand what tribes are affiliated with those items that may be in your collection. You just have to dig in and do some research in a lot of cases. And then all the tribal governments are listed on the Ohio History Connection website. And a lot of those tribal governments have, if you go to their websites, you can click on the link at AmericanIndianRelations.org through our web. I'm probably saying it wrong, sorry. But
I'm putting it into the chat.
there you go. And so we linked all the federally recognized tribes, and if they have a web page, you can click on it. And oftentimes they put up their own history. You can contact staff that way. You could call a tribal office and say, "Here, I'm trying to reach somebody. Can you help me figure out who to contact?" I wouldn't let it overly intimidate you. It's better to try to reach folks instead of not reaching out at all.
Great. Let me just, I think I forgot the .org. There we go. All right. Final question before we wrap up. Are there American Indian artifacts, not human remains, that were collected in Delaware County, Ohio, that are being held at OHC that might better serve to educate the public by being displayed in facilities in the area from which they originated? Understanding that this would be with the guidance from tribal consultants. So Benny, that's a great question. I don't know the answer, but we can certainly connect you with our curators. Actually, Stacey, you might be aware. I would be surprised if there weren't, but I can't say for certain that there are, but we can certainly get that info for you. In terms of sort of moving artifacts from our facility to another facility for display or interpretation, I think, we're certainly open to that, assuming that that is something that is also a desire from our tribal nation partners. So I think you outlined the process exactly, that we would consult with tribal partners and then work with you all to see that happen. So please feel free to reach back out to me directly. I'll put my email in the chat, and you can also go to our website at the link that I put on there and get a little bit more information. So www.ohiohistory.org/AIR is where you'll find the policy. You'll also find guidelines that were drafted ahead of the policy's release that I think you'll find useful as well. That's also something Stacey worked on. And you'll find a lot of other context as well. Thank you so much, Stacey, for joining us, for coming back. And we're so grateful for all the work that you did to get this policy established and passed. And we're looking forward to working with all of you all in the Local History Alliance to help support your work with American Indian tribes.
Thank you all. It was great to be here today.
Thanks, everybody. Take care. Bye.